start out with today, I want to start looking at a slide. I want to get your impression on this. I love church signs. And this church sign is, we love hurting people. I don't think it's what they intended.
Wow, well,
I get it. Funny kind of things. It's funny at first. We know what they meant. They love people who are hurting. When you step back and think about it, I think most of us have probably been hurt at church at some point in time. We probably have wounds from something that someone said, something that someone did or didn't do. Unfortunately, this sign maybe is more accurate than I want to admit. One of the ways that we get hurt is how rules and laws are applied sometimes, of how expectations are placed on us because of how law gets put on us. I want to think about that a little bit. If we go to the next slide, remember last week we talked about exciting Hebrew words, Torah and Yara, noun and verb. But the idea that law is teaching guidance. Law is not the target that we're aiming for. God himself is who we're looking to reach. The law is a guide to get us to get to that target, to help us reach God, so we know where he is, so we don't get wayward. I'll tell a story that I think brings this out a little bit. So the next slide, I have the story of Big Hunter. Big Hunter was a chief of the Sioux Nation, the portion that was up in Canada. And missionaries came to the tribe, and he wanted to become a Christian. But an issue was that the Sioux Nation there, they were polygamous. He had multiple wives. And so the missionaries told him, well, if you're going to follow God, you need to follow his laws, and you need to have only one wife. So you can become a Christian once you take care of that issue. This was a struggle for Big Hunter because of how their social fabric was. In order for that to happen, he knew his wives would starve. There's no social fabric to hold them once he cast them out of his family. So after struggling with this, Big Hunter chose one wife, and he had the others hung. And he came to the missionaries and he told them what he'd done, and they chased him out as a murderer. Big Hunter married more wives, rejected God, never became a Christian. That situation, people were trying to do the right thing. But did they put law in front of God? An expectation of someone to understand everything before they knew God. We go on to the next slide. We're going to be talking about the Jerusalem Council today. This was a situation in which there was a struggle over how do we use the law. Peter had gone to Cornelius' house. Paul and Barnabas had been out to Crete, to Lystra. Scads of Gentiles were becoming Christians. Now there's a group of Jewish Christians saying, well, shouldn't you be Jewish to become Christian? Don't you need to hold all of these Jewish laws if you're going to be a Christian? So there's this discussion, and there's a problem, because there's three main issues. One is that group of Jewish Christians were saying, you need to eat clean. You need to follow all the ceremonial food laws for things to work. You need to sacrifice correctly, and you need to observe the festivals. So there's this discussion going on, but there's two problems for the Gentiles to make this work. One is, this stuff is weird. They didn't grow up with this background. It's not making a whole lot of sense. Another thing is they can't live in their communities. If they're going to eat perfectly clean, remain completely clean, they can't live with their families. It's kind of a problem. During this discussion, Peter stands up and says this. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor your fathers have been able to bear? No, we believe it is is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are. He says, we Jews, we never were saved because of the law. The law has never saved us to begin with. We can't put this yoke on other people. It's not going to save them. Jesus Christ alone is how we come to know God. Acts chapter 15. It's on page 783 in the Pew Bibles. So we have this laid out in which there's this struggle over what's the law and how do we use the law. Peter has stood up. He's given his piece. And now James stands up, who's kind of the head dog of the group. And this is what James has to say as we read through these verses. Starting with verse 12. The whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the miraculous signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. When they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God at first showed his concern by taking from the Gentiles a people for himself. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it is written. After this I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild, and I will restore it. That the remnant of men may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does these things that have been known for ages. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. What I want us to think about is the tension that's in this group. This is a big deal, thinking through, what does it mean to be a Christian? What really defines us of making us Christians? Something that we wrestle with today. So I have this picture of Peter standing up and saying, don't you remember? Christ has risen from the grave. This is what defines us. And James stands up and says, I agree with Peter. I'm with Peter. I agree with this. There's a few things that we should know about James. I find it interesting. From history, from the historian Josephus, we know that James was a Jew's Jew. He kept the laws really, really tight. And now he's saying, you know what? But you don't need that to be a Christian. Another thing that's interesting is that he works from the book of Amos. Verses 16 through 18 are a quote from the book of Amos. If we go on to the next slide, we get an idea of where he's going with this. First he talks about tents, that the tent of David is repaired. David was promised an eternal throne. Got kind of damaged during the exile. There's nobody on the throne. And now Jesus Christ is on that throne. And so here, James is saying that is fulfilled. That prophecy is fulfilled, and so therefore what comes next is fulfilled, that Gentiles are included. We don't exclude anybody. Everybody's included. And I think he's also tying in a theme of the book of Amos. The book of Amos aims at telling people ritual religion, when it's mixed with not doing justice to your neighbor, is despicable to God. Ritual religion, while not doing justice to your neighbor, is despicable to God. I think that theme is applicable to here, which James is thinking about. Are we doing justice to our Gentile brothers? What Peter was talking about was putting a yoke that didn't belong on them. So he's being very careful. He's saying, there's truth with what Peter's saying. And then he turns around and says, and now there's 4 rules you have to follow. Which is kind of interesting. It kind of catches me off guard. I say, I agree with Peter. And now here's 4 rules you have to follow. So let's take a look at those rules, kind of quick. We'll go through those. On the next slide, I think we have to be careful to look at what these rules are about. So you have a tape rule. So a tape rule is to measure how big something is. He's not using the law to say, how big of a Christian are you? Are you a 3-rule Christian? A 4-rule Christian? It's not doing that. It's more of a handrail. So what's a handrail for? To guide you. Hopefully so you don't fall. And that's a long ways down in this picture. It's to keep us safe, to keep us going towards where we want to meet God. We're headed towards our destination. If we go on to the next slide, we have the idea of moral standards. What James lays out first is about sexual immorality. He says there's guardrails to keep us headed towards God. This is a fitting one for the Gentiles because they didn't know that there were rules about this. Their conscience isn't tuned into this at all. They don't realize that there's guardrails here. And so if you go on to the next slide, this is the same picture that we just looked at. The guardrails didn't look all that important before. And then when you see the cliff, you realize there's something significant here. I think what James is saying is these guardrails I'm putting up for you, these are important so you don't go off the road. So you continue on the road towards God. And maybe you don't realize how dangerous this situation is. So he throws out this idea of guardrails. I think about for myself. Do I think I have any guardrails? Am I concerned at all about keeping the 10 Commandments? Do I ask myself at all, are there places in life in which I don't really care if I'm without a guardrail? Like, yeah, that commandment doesn't matter to me so much. Maybe to a family member, but not to me. I wonder how much I compromise my guardrails. Let's go on to the next one. The next is unity. Does anybody here go rock climbing? Really? That counts. I've only watched it on TV. What do I know? Okay, but I've read about it on Wikipedia. So I'm going to share with you what I know, because I know quite a bit. So the way I understand rock climbing, one way that you can do it is belaying, in which you have people kind of connected to each other, and there's friction applied to the rope. So if somebody falls, they don't fall forever, they get caught. There's a sense of unity going on here as they go towards their destination. James throws out 2 rules, which I have to say, really? He's concerned about blood, he's concerned about strangled animals, which is blood again. I think that's ceremonial law. Is he really worried about that? I think that's kind of set aside. But the problem is, if people come together for church, Jews can't sit with Gentiles. If a Gentile breaks out a blood sandwich, it's not going to work for the Jew. There's no unity if possible. There's nobody there to belay with. It separates, it divides the church. And James is saying it's important to let go of things that aren't that important. To seek out ways to work together. So the next slide, I've wrestled with this a little bit because when I played team sports, I've always been told there is no I in TEAM. Right? Thank you. My spelling's on the money today. But then you think about unity has an I in it. Also has a U. But focus on the I. There's an I involved in unity. There's an I involved in the unity of the church here, of giving offense and taking offense. James is telling the Gentiles, don't give offense by something that's not that big a deal to overcome. Don't bring your blood to these things. It's not that big a deal. Don't give offense. Now, on the other hand, he's telling the Jews, don't take offense. Don't take offense at any little thing that might get under your skin. Unity is important. Think about for us, what implications does this have? How often is it that I give offense because I don't really think about what other people might feel passionately about? How might I take offense because I'm more concerned about myself? Or how might I take offense because I don't realize that maybe some people just don't know? Giving offense and taking offense are important issues right from the get-go. Unity is a key of why these rules are in place. On the next slide, the last one that I want to talk about is James talked about food offered to idols. To avoid that. Later on in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about this. And he talks about how sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not. When you're driving on a road with a dotted line, and someone is driving really slow in front of you, when is it okay to pass? When no one's coming. You guys passed the driver's test. This is good. This is good. All right, when is it not safe to pass? When somebody's coming. And you're passing on the left, you're not passing on the right. And so, there are times in which it's safe to pass and not safe to pass. Right here at this time, it is not safe to pass. People aren't going to get that about this idol thing. They're still kind of captured by this idol idea. And James is saying, don't take the risk. Don't eat the food offered to idols just to play it safe. So the next slide, we wrestle with this idea of contextualization. Because when you contextualize, you want to make a message that's understandable and livable. So James is taking all of this Jewish background, and he's saying, okay, here are 4 rules that are easy for you to understand. But at the same time, he puts a level. He says, but we're not going to go further than this point, so you hold on to what it means to be a Christian. Don't mix in the idol stuff. You can take contextualization too far. I use Spanish class as an example a lot because it was a traumatic event for me. But I think that this explains it. Thank you. When I went to college, I tested out a year of Spanish. So I only had to do 1 year, so this was great, but it's a higher level Spanish. I hadn't taken Spanish for almost 3 years. So I went in and sat down, and the professor only spoke in Spanish. I understood nothing. There was no contextualization. I raised my hand, he wouldn't answer me in English. It was disturbing. And so, what do I sat there and I didn't understand what was going on. And at the same time, the professor wasn't going to lower the bar and speak in English, because what was I going to learn? If he just spoke in English, I was just going to keep speaking in English. There's a tension between contextualizing and taking it too far. James is trying to walk that line here of what makes the gospel message understandable and livable for people without going too far. That's something that we have to wrestle with. And I think it's tricky because I think that our tendency sometimes is to take moral standards, the guardrails, and say, well, we can contextualize those. We can move the guardrails. But we can't. I think on the other hand, sometimes we take personal opinions, politics, some social issues, and we make those moral standards. And we say, this way is it. This is a guardrail, when it's not. We end up making a hindrance of the way that we speak, the way that we convey things, in which people kind of shut out the gospel because they're hearing a lot more than the gospel message. They're hearing Carl's opinions, and not the core message. So go to the next slide. We get to verse 21. And James says, you hear the law every week at synagogue. He's telling them, there's these 4 rules, but then people keep learning. Don't worry about it. And for us, I think sometimes we have a sense of that we graduate. That we've graduated from needing to learn more about God's Word, or learn more about God. And James makes it clear here, there's not a graduation ceremony when you reach a magical age. You have to keep going. So the last question I want to end with is, which is it? On the last slide here, there's a picture of a tape rule and the handrail. Which is it for us as individuals? How do I use the law in my own life? As some sort of tape measure of how good am I in with God right now? Am I doing enough things that God likes me because I'm following 6 rules instead of 5 rules? Or do I look at God's laws and rules as a handrail to be closer to Him? Of knowing what it means to live for Him, of a guide to be closer to Him. What about as a church? Do we use laws and rules trying to see how much of a Christian somebody is? Or do we look at laws and rules as a blessing to draw closer to God, as a handrail? When I think about that first slide with "we love hurting people," I hope that we don't put that on our church sign. But if we do, I hope people realize what it really means. We love people who are hurting, not the other way around.